Today we have with us Scientia Professor Andrew Martin. How are you, Professor?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Fine, thank you. It's an honor and privilege, honestly. Thank you for your time.
Good to be here.
Your predominant work is around motivation, engagement, learning, and achievement. But today we will talk about motivation in the AI era because things are already shifted and shifting rapidly. And in this era, how student or professionals or in music or in sports in any field, how we can use our definition of motivation we will learn from you today. So the first basic question, motivation. What is it? Is it a natural phenomena? Is it an individual phenomena? Is it a like a societal thing, psychological thing? What is it?
So I guess the big picture definition would be that it's students' inclination, energy, and drive to learn and achieve and work to potential. That's in the student, the academic space. The same would apply in the workplace, and employees, energy and drive to do what they set out to do. That's the big picture definition, but we find that's often a little too vague and for example, a student or a teacher to grab onto. And so, what we've also identified is there are key parts to motivation. So, motivation being this big thing, but under that are specific facets of motivation. And I can talk about those in a little while. Really good question around this sort of nature nurture idea. Our view is that motivation is what we call state-like. That is, it's a modifiable attribute that tends to be domain specific, specific to a situation. And in that being the case, we see it as a little more nurture than nature in that respect. So it's not what we call a trait-like factor, such as personality or temperament. Take much longer to shift, for example, if you can shift them at all. That said, there are clearly nature or genetic aspects to motivation. So, as I'll talk about a little later, one aspect of motivation is fear of failure, and there's an anxiety component to that. And so we know that anxiety is genetic, there's a genetic aspect to anxiety. And so so that being the case, there's a nature aspect to anxiety and therefore a nature aspect to motivation. And so that sort of deals with that nature nurture aspect. Is it an individual thing or more of a social or group thing or construct? In our research, one thing we do in schools, for example, is to see, we know each student has their level of motivation, but is there such a thing as classroom motivation? Is there a collective motivation in a classroom? Or indeed a school? Can a school be characterized as being a motivated school or whatever? Um, and what we find, it's a technique called multi-level modeling, where you're able to see what percentage of motivation is at the student level, what percentage at the classroom level, and what percentage at the school level. And motivation, for the most part, is very individualistic. There are far more differences within a classroom in motivation than there are between classrooms in motivation. And that makes teaching tough. You really have, if there's 25 kids in a class, they are 25 very individual creatures with their own levels of motivation. And so that's why one of the reasons teaching is difficult and challenging. So motivation is a very individual thing. It resides within the person. A school doesn't have it. Sure, we can get an average score for a school, but when we do the proper analyses, we find actually that's just the sum total of very different levels of motivation within the school. And so that's the question. It's a motivation is a very intrinsic, intrapsychic phenomenon. Your motivation, good time, and mine are very individualistic. It sits deep within us. And so that's why it's more of an individual attribute than a group level attribute. And so the question around is there is a biological aspect to it. So, for example, I mentioned anxiety. There's the biology there. Definitely a psychological aspect. For example, things like self-efficacy and your valuing of school. That's very psychological, and there's also a social aspect to it. And so, even though each of us are very individualistic in our motivation, that motivation is affected by our parents, our peers, our teachers, and so on. So there is a social dimension to that. So yeah, so there's a bit of a whirlwind tour of motivation and different dimensions and aspects to it.
Whatever you mentioned, so it's more individualistic, but there is definitely nurture element, societal element, all these things are there. And these all definitions are kind of shifting in this AI era. Which way? Probably we still don't know, but people are getting more and more isolated from the community setup and group setup. So does this definition of motivation or engagement remain same, or it is changing or changed or shifted towards something we already know?
Very good question. And so for example, I mentioned there are different facets to motivation, and we'll dive into those shortly. What we're finding is the same dimensions of motivation exist in the AI era. So, for example, if you're using generative AI, to support you in a particular task, there's still going to be there's going to be a level of self-efficacy or confidence you bring to that. There'll still be a level of, how well you're able to self-regulate and manage yourself as you do that, not letting it do all the work for you and you using it appropriately. There may be some element of anxiety or not in how you're using it. So all the different features of motivation, just as when you were having to open up a hard copy textbook in the 1970s to do your homework, there's still those facets of motivation as you're now into 2026 cracking open, ChatGPT to do your homework as well. So the same motivation dimensions, wherever you have to do something, wherever you have to perform, wherever you're evaluated in some way, these dimensions of motivation always come into play. So that's the case. And so all the factors of motivation that existed is it October or November 2023 when the first release of GPT was put out there. Prior to that, the same dimensions of motivation come into play today. What's interesting, though, is what shifts there may be on those dimensions. So even though the same dimensions come into play, are there going to be shifts in, for example, students' confidence as they're using it? Are there going to be shifts in? So one aspect of motivation is what we call valuing. So valuing school, valuing what you're valuing maths, valuing what you're learning, how important is it to you? And so valuing is one dimension of motivation, for example. And one thing we've been noticing, so we've been tracking motivation actually since 1999, all the way through the pandemic, all the way through to today. And one thing we found during the pandemic, for example, was a lot of all the motivation dimensions just really crashed. Students really struggled to stay motivated through lockdown and so on. We're now seeing most of those motivation levels coming back to pre-pandemic levels. But there's one factor that has not bounced back like the other factors, and that's the valuing factor. So when we ask students to report on our motivation tools, so the one we use is called the motivation and engagement scale, where students self-rate their motivation on different dimensions, one of them being valuing, how much you value school, how much you value learning. The answers to that are still pretty low, almost still at pandemic levels. We haven't quite got to the bottom of that. All the other dimensions have gone up. So, your self-belief, your effort, your self-regulation, they've bounced back, but not valuing. We haven't got to the bottom of it, and we've got a few ideas, one of which is the fact that now that AI is in the mix, and it can give you all the answers that maybe a teacher could have given you and so on, or school can provide, and in some cases, maybe even more in-depth information, students may not be seeing the value of teaching and school and so on now that AI is sitting there giving it all to them. That's one of our speculations. We do need to investigate that, but that's a very good example of a shift in motivation as a function of AI now being in play. What another shift in motivation, for example, in earlier days, a year or two ago, confidence and self-efficacy to use AI was relatively low, especially among teachers. And how do we bring it into the classroom? How do we do this or that with it? That confidence is growing as there's more exposure to it. So there's another shift in motivation. So the same motivation factors are in play, whether you're talking about football, whether you're talking about the workplace, valuing self-efficacy, but as they are in AI, we're seeing shifts in these motivation factors, AI-specific shifts that are quite interesting.
Hmm. Now, this is kind of a personal question in the sense we got this AI tool pretty much after mid 40s, early 50s and stuff like that. So we have seen the world a little bit. We have got some experience. So we are hopefully matured to handle a mature tool. Many of us are saying AI information access is like just easy now. It's like this. Then what about this wisdom or the experience which like human being put on the table, the thinking, the human development? Because these young kids or students, they are handling this mature tool not from this maturity. How are you seeing it?
Yeah, and that's a big question. What does it mean for us? What does it mean for our development? What does it mean for how we think? And as you say, that word wisdom, if it's just sitting there at your fingertips. I'll talk as an educational and instructional psychologist. And so my view or my take on that, on experience, development, wisdom, is you're talking about long-term memory. So long-term memory refers to this vast storage in our back there in the back room there, of our that brain of ours, and it is everything we know. It is everything we can do. Just think of probably the millions of bits of knowledge and skill and information that got us out of bed and to this podcast. I mean, all the things that we had to put together, including when that thing went off as I'm lying in bed, there's an annoying noise next to me, and I realize, oh, that's the alarm. How did I know that? Then I get up and I reach for the door handle. How do I even know that was a door handle? All of these things that we put together to finally for you and I to sit here and talk to each other. Millions of little chunks of knowledge and information and skill, probably. And that's just this situation. So long-term memory is everything we know, everything we can do, and some would say who we are. We are our long-term memory. And so the more we delegate tasks to AI, the less opportunity we have to learn it ourselves. That is, the less opportunity we have to build up our body of long-term memory. Because by building up our long-term memory, that is how we grow. That is how we develop. And so that is why school and teachers and teaching are transformative. You walk into the classroom and you walk out of the classroom having something more in that long-term memory of yours. And every time that happens, you are transformed. That is the transformative power of education. And so if AI starts doing more of that for us, we lose the opportunity to transform and to develop. And so the more we delegate to AI, the more we offload, it's called cognitive offloading to AI, the less we build, the less our long-term memory grows, and by implication, so our wisdom takes a hit, our development takes a hit. We need to think about how do we use AI to support learning so that we continue to build up our body of long-term memory, and in so doing, build our wisdom, build our development. And it's my view that the kids of the future, the kids and people that get ahead in the future are the ones that bring a vast storage of long-term memory together with AI. Those will be the ones that get ahead in the future of schooling, university, college, and work, because they're the ones that are able to interact in far more expert and agentic ways with AI. That is, and they will be optimized to a greater extent. They can provide better prompts. They're less likely to get hallucinations because they're providing very good input and good prompts. They're able to distill and discern and synthesize information. The students that don't have much in their long-term memory come to AI in a very naive way, vague, poor, weak prompting, inability to discern what's true and what's not. And so it'll be garbage in, garbage out. And so those students will be held back in the future of school, university, college, and work. So I really argue, even in the future of AI, a strong body of long-term memory, the more we can continue to teach kids and give them good reasons to learn. So when we explain to students, that's why it's important for you to learn, because when that body of long-term memory that you've now built up comes together with AI, you are in a far stronger position to use it in agentic and constructive and productive ways. And by implication, get ahead.
Already, there are many research done around abundance and like lots of choices when in front of you, you get confused or you don't, you stop rather trying to find what you actually need or search for meaning, whatever you call it.
Mm, mm,
So AI definitely makes everything easy, a lot of choices. Does abundance create motivational problems that scarcity never did?
mm. Yes, and another important question. My view on these attributes is meaning and purpose, life satisfaction, broader self-esteem. They're sort of big distal, they're sort of global outcomes, big picture outcomes. In my view, those are affected by everyday experiences, such as the motivation and learning that happens. And over time, they start contributing to your broader life satisfaction, your sense of meaning and purpose, and so on. That's my view. It's sort of seen as a bottom-up view of life satisfaction. How do we get meaning in life? Well, in my view, what's the old accountant's expression? Take care of the pennies, and the pounds will take care of themselves. And so this idea of this more daily, this daily experience, in my view, gives rise to these broader, more global constructs such as life satisfaction, which is why I like studying things like task-specific motivation and learning, because over time I think they build up the all boats rise in that tide when we're getting, task to task, situation to situation. So that being the case, that is where AI again affects. It's in these daily activities, how are we interacting with it, task to task, situation to situation. And so I believe that effortful achievement, effortful success is the stuff that motivates. And so that's my view on motivation. And therefore, if we regulate AI, self-regulate AI effectively, so we stay effortful, it's not doing it all for us, and we stay effortful, that lays the foundation for obviously learning and also motivation. Again, the more we delegate to AI and the less effortful our achievement is, I think that can start impeding a sense of satisfaction, a sense of meaning and purpose in the task itself. And so I think it comes down to how effectively we regulate AI so that, of course, it can support us in the path to achievement, Uh, but we're able to self-regulate it to the extent that there's an effortfulness about it that ensures that we're learning along the way and by implication being motivated along the way.
It sounded like more we exercise on our long-term memory, like how we kind of make it stronger, it actually make our manifestation of life better in that way. Okay. So in your research, there are 11 dimensions in our motivation and engagement, and you call it motivation and engagement wheel. Please explain that 11 dimensions and how you are saying this will help ordinary people for more motivation.
Yes, so so I mentioned at the start of our conversation, motivation is a fairly vague, nebulous, swirly, blurry construct, really. And so when we, for example, tell a student to be more motivated, he or she, they may agree they do need to be more motivated. When we ask them, so what are you going to do about that? They haven't got the foggiest idea what they're going to do. I don't know, do more. I don't know what he was talking about when he told me to be more motivated. And so we have to land motivation to ground. We have to make it concrete and visible and something that students, parents, everyone can look at and say, yes, I see what that is. And so, motivation, we do that by identifying the specific dimensions that underpin student motivation. And we've developed the motivation and engagement wheel that identifies 11 key dimensions of motivation and engagement. And they're actually not just for school students. They're the same dimensions. We take the wheel into the workplace, we take the wheel into the sporting domain, we take it into the music domain. Back to that thing I mentioned earlier, wherever a human being has to do something, wherever they're required to perform, wherever they're to be evaluated in some way, the wheel sits there and these factors come into play. And so there are four groups. So the 11 factors sit in. So one group is what we call positive motivation. And that includes self-belief, so confidence, valuing, and a learning focus, so being focused on effort and mastery and learning and so on. The second group is what we call positive engagement, and there are three parts under that. One is planning and monitoring, so planning what you're going to do and monitoring your progress as you do it. The second is task management, so managing yourself as a student or as a sports person or as an employee. So for example, that AI comes into that. So how well do you, I mentioned the term self-regulation of AI, how well do you maybe use AI so that it supports the process but doesn't do the work for you? That's good example of task management. And the third is persistence. So, what do students do when they don't get the answer first go? The third group is what we call negative motivation. So we usually think about motivation as it's always a good thing, but in actual fact, there are what we call maladaptive dimensions of motivation. So, for example, anxiety is one part of that in the wheel. Another one is fear of failure. That's another part in the wheel. And another one is low or uncertain control, where students feel they're not in the driver's seat, they're not in control of things. And then the fourth group of factors in the wheel, what we call negative engagement. And there are two parts to that. One is what we refer to as self-sabotage or self-handicapping. And so this is where students will put obstacles in their path to success. So for example, or workers or sports people or musicians, again, wherever they have to perform. And usually when there's a test or an exam coming up, that's when self-sabotage is more likely. So examples of obstacles are procrastination, wasting time, doing little or no study, clowning around in class, going out the night before the exam, cleaning the house, cleaning the bedroom, anything, but actually doing the study you're meant to be doing. And so why do students do this? It's not just students, athletes do it, employees do it. What we find is these students but let's keep it safe. We'll talk about the students and not us, Gautam. And so what we find is these students are fearful of failure. And even though they increase the chances of poor performance, if you don't do any study, you're not likely to do so well. Even though they increase the chance of poor performance, they manage to establish an excuse or an alibi in case they don't do so well. And so they can blame the lack of effort on the poor performance rather than blame a lack of ability. Why would someone want to blame effort rather than ability? Well, what the research is clear that ability, when students, when the cause of poor performance is due to a lack of ability, that has very adverse effects on your self-worth and self-esteem. No one likes feeling dumb. No one likes failing. And if we think we failed or performed poorly due to a lack of ability, that damages our self-worth. But if you can attribute it to a lack of effort, no one can conclude you lack ability if you haven't tried hard enough. So the self-saboteur shifts the attribution from self-worth damaging attribution to ability and onto a self-worth protective attribution, such as a lack of effort. And so even though they don't avoid failure or poor performance per se, they avoid the self-worth damaging implications of poor performance. And then the 11th factor is disengagement. Disengagement is, after a while, their self-sabotage doesn't work, the excuses run out, the alibis don't, no one believes them anymore, and so a student gives up even trying to establish an alibi, and they become disengaged. And disengagement, Gautam, is the end of the line. That is in the motivation engagement world, that is the toughest place to be, disengagement. But I'll get back to a comment I made earlier. Everything in the wheel are state-like factors. They are modifiable. And that is, disengagement is not you're not stuck with it. There are reasons you're in this disengagement space. And so that we start there as the path out of disengagement. And so even though disengagement is a tough spot, students are not stuck with it. If we take the time to get good information, get good data, really identify what's going on, there's never, I sometimes provocatively suggest disengagement is a rational response. We've never found no reason for disengagement. An engaged student doesn't wake up one morning and say, you know what, I think I'll give disengagement a go today. They don't do that. And so there are reasons. We take the time, we do the forensics, we get good information, good data, a good 360 on this disengaged kid, talking to the other teachers, talking to parents, seeing what's going on, talking to the student, and start unearthing what's troubling this kid. So those are the 11 parts of the wheel, sitting under 4 higher order factors: positive motivation, positive engagement, negative motivation, negative engagement. And so now that when I talked about every one of those 11 factors, they're all landed to ground. Every student understands what you're talking about when you're talking about these, whereas motivation, a bit vague, a bit swirly. What does the student do with it? But now the motivation engagement wheel brings clarity, and so the student can see it and understand it. You can have concrete conversations with parents and so on, and that's what the wheel is and what it's for.
All right. So on that 11 dimensions and that motivation and engagement wheel, you developed a product called Learning Buddy. It's kind of using AI as your mate. Please explain that, Professor.
Yes. So this is where, was it Kurt Lewin that said, there's nothing so practical as a good theory. And so once you identify the specific aspects of motivation engagement, that allows you to do quite a lot of things, either as a researcher or as a practitioner. So, for example, we've developed the motivation engagement scale that students can rate themselves, and you can get a score on each part of the motivation wheel for that student. So that's, without the wheel, you couldn't have developed the scale. So now that we have the wheel, it's also a very effective tool for intervention and support for students. Now that we have the wheel, we can develop strategies for each part of it to support students. And this is where AI has become very, very helpful. One problem with AI in schools and classrooms and so on is that it's being used in very chaotic ways, very ad hoc ways, ineffective, inefficient ways. And so, what we're saying as educational psychologists is we need to bring a more organization and order and structure to school and classroom teacher and student use of AI. And one way, and so what we're talking about is psychologically informed AI use. And so the wheel is one way we can bring structure to support students in their learning. And so the Gen AI motivation and learning buddy, it's open access, anyone can use it, email it, post it, upload it. It's open access, fully open access. What it does is it's developed 11 prompt scripts, one prompt script for each part of the motivation engagement wheel. And so, for example, let's take self-belief. If a student, when they are going about preparing for an exam or they're doing a large project or whatever, and they're not feeling very confident about how they're going about it, or they're not feeling confident about the task, they can take the self-belief prompt script from the AI Buddy, Gen AI Buddy, paste it into a major AI tool, GPT, Copilot, Gemini, Claude, whatever, and it will walk a student through exercises and ideas and strategies to build their self-belief for that specific task. And so the Gen AI Motivation Learning Buddy it's a good example of how we use AI to support the process rather than using AI to do the work for us. And so if you go to the prompt scripts, we've inserted very clearly, do not tell me the answer, do not tell me the answer, do not do the work for me. We've been very explicit in the prompt scripts. The other thing is, when you look at the prompt scripts, they're very detailed. We could have, I guess, we could have put them behind an AI agent, and that you wouldn't have seen all this line by line script. But it's partly also about making it transparent to actually teach teachers and students, hey, here are ways you can actually write script in very constructive ways to support the learning process, but absolutely not doing the learning or giving the answer on that task. And so that's a good example of where the prompt scripts themselves are teaching students acceptable AI use. And if you took out some of those lines, so if you remove the line, do not tell me the answer, that then flips it into unacceptable use. And so we want to teach kids what's an example of acceptable, what's an example of unacceptable. And so we're hoping teachers can walk students through these prompt scripts to say, here are good guardrails to ensure that it's used as a learning partner, not the thing that's doing the learning itself. Remember, back to long-term memory, we want students to build up their long-term memory. And so when you look at the prompt scripts, these are all pathways to that, rather than doing it itself. The more the AI does the work itself for the student, then the student's long-term memory is compromised.
So your wheel identifies that self-belief is the fundamental of learning and achievement. Okay. Now, because of the social media or whatever bombardment of information, we sometimes get confused between self-belief, biased, ego, all these things. So what is self-belief and how it is different from ego or bias or
Yeah,
whatever?
yeah, yeah. Nice question. And so, all right, so self-belief. So this is the world according to Andrew. Okay, so self-belief, in my view, is a domain-specific belief in your capacity to do something. And so a specific task, as opposed to, for example, general self-esteem, which is your broader sense of, how good you are or not. Self-belief, from a motivation perspective, is usually situation specific and task specific. So you're asked to do a maths problem, different students will have different levels of self-belief in their capacity to do that maths question. So that's self-belief, task specific, situation specific. Ego is, in my view, getting back to self-worth, when your capacity to do something successfully or your capacity to achieve is too closely tethered and tied to your self-worth as a person. This idea about what our self-worth is tethered to has big implications in educational psychology, motivation, and learning. And so, for example, the more in our research, the more a student's self-worth, their worth as a human being is tied to the marks they get in a test, the more at risk of fear of failure they are, and the more at risk of things of problematic responses to that, ranging from perfectionism. Many a perfectionist has been a failure fearer, all the way through to, as I mentioned, self-sabotage and disengagement. Why does this tying our worth, our ego, to our marks or our achievements make us so vulnerable? Well, remember, our self-worth is our most precious, that's one of the most precious attributes. Our worth as a human being is as fundamental to us. And we'll go to great lengths to protect that. We don't willingly go into situations where our worth will be damaged. And so one way it can be damaged is if we tie our worth to the marks we get in a test, and therefore this test is not only a test of my knowledge of the causes of World War II, for example, but it's also a test of my self-worth. Is there any wonder I'm frightened of, getting nervous? I'll also go a little further, and that is the worth students will receive at the home can also be tied to their marks. And so they are celebrated as a human being more when they get an A than when they get a D or an E. I'll go one step further again. Parents' own worth can be wrapped up in their child's achievement. And so and kids know this, is it any wonder this kid's terrified of the next test or exam when it's not only a test of their history knowledge, it's a test of their self-worth, it's a test of the worth that's meted out in the home and perhaps also in the school, and it's a test of their parents' worth. Goodness me, could we make the stakes any higher? And so the more we tether our self-worth to achievement, the more vulnerable we are in any achievement scenario. And I will say that that's ego, where our worth as a person is tethered to our capacity to achieve. So what's the answer? Well, first of all, when a child gets an A grade, or it doesn't make them a fundamentally better human being. And if they get an E grade, it doesn't make them a fundamentally worse human we've got to ensure that children's worth is intact. A bad mark walks through the front door at home. Parents say, we love you, we want to keep you, you're ours, we value you, you are worthwhile. However, that doesn't mean the conversation doesn't move right on to other factors that parents can communicate disappointment. And that is, for example, they might not have put enough effort in. Their study strategies may be ineffective. They might have gone out the night before the exam. They might have been studying but having their mobile phone on the whole time. You can focus on those things because those are the things that led to the poor result in history. Not the child's worth. That wasn't the cause of the poor performance. And so I talk to parents, I talk to teachers and students about sort of separating one's worth as a person and saying, look, that's a given, that's intact, but focusing on the behaviors and the attitudes, for example, that are modifiable, that were the cause of the poor performance. Likewise, if they walk in the front door at home and they got a terrific result, that doesn't make them a human being. They shouldn't be loved more because they got that A grade. What the parents can do is celebrate the effort that went into that, celebrate the positive attitude, celebrate the fact that they they kept their mobile phone out of the bedroom when they were studying that night. Celebrate those factors because those are the factors that led to that good result. When you do those things, you're actually then the students, you're not setting up these fear of failure dynamics in the home or in the school, and so by doing those things, by fostering good study habits, effort, good processes, good practices, you're building self-belief and you're keeping that ego thing, problematic bases of self-worth, separate from all of that. And in so doing, students are not so fearful. So there's a very long-winded story of self-belief, which is task-specific and tethered to effort, strategy, and so on, skill building, knowledge building, and ego, which is what do you tie your self-worth wagon to? And if it's tied to your capacity to achieve, then that is ego and problematic in my view.
So to have or to develop this self-worth, is it okay or is it the right way to think, like more exposure to things or situations or circumstances where kids are exposed towards failure in a small dose? As much as you do that, self-worth kind of help to grow up. Is it the right way to see?
And a related question is sometimes I also get that question on building students' resilience, for example. Should we expose them to desirable difficulty and build that up? In my view, life has a habit of throwing difficulty at you anyway, and we don't need to find ways to impose it on kids any more than so I don't think we should look for opportunities to make things difficult. However, I do like this the idea, and we've done a fair bit of research on this, the idea of personal best goal setting and personal best goal striving. And so that gets to this idea of where a student is focused, or any human being is focused um, on improving on their prior effort and performance more than outperforming others. So you look to outperform yourself more than outperform others. And so I think one way to build a concrete sense of self-belief and one way to have a true growth orientation to one's life is through things like personal best goal setting and striving. And we've done a lot of research on PBs in the classroom, PBs and students, and we have very positive results. And so, what more can we ask of a human being than to strive to do a little bit better or do a little bit more than they did before? And if they do that incrementally over the course of a week, over the course of a year, across 13 or so years of school, we will see remarkable growth. And so getting back to how do we build a sense of self, a sense of worth? Do we need to impose difficulty? No, but I think we can encourage students to pursue their own level of desirable difficulty through personal best goal setting and goal striving.
We are almost in the end of it. And the last question to you is, we are more resourceful than our parents. And the way societies are going down the line, it will be more and more resourceful and less kids to any parents.
Hmm.
What is your take on this parenting style where they are overprotective? They are trying to give everything to the kids because they have less number of kids and more resources, and maybe guilt sometimes because they are also busy, not giving enough attention, etc. How these things come to play for kids' self-worth?
Yeah. So in the main, there are three parenting styles. One one is what we call authoritarian parenting, and that's parenting with very clear boundaries, consequences, relatively little autonomy, and so clear structure in the home, clear expectations. However, there's not a lot of warmth in there, and consequences are designed to punish rather than teach, for example. At the other end of the continuum is what we call laissez-faire, and that's where there are very few boundaries, very few consequences, not much structure in the house, no routines to speak of, lots of warmth and lots of autonomy. And so that's at the other end. And sitting in the middle is authoritative parenting, clear boundaries, structure, routines, high expectations, clear consequences. However, all of that is accompanied with warmth, and consequences, for example, are designed to teach, not to punish. And so authoritative parenting, sitting in the middle, tends to be associated with more positive development in their children, including positive development of their self-worth. And so it's that sort of parenting. So, for example, to the helicopter parent, as one example, I might say, look, okay, if you're in your helicopter, that's better than being a neglectful parent. Let's be clear. And so, but you might, if you're hovering at 200 meters above your child, maybe hover at 400 meters above your child. And so I talk to parents about where they are and how they can strive for a personal best in their own parenting. If they're a little too laissez-faire, then how can they nudge that up to having a little more structure, clearer boundaries, clearer expectations around mobile technology, all that sort of stuff. And so I talk to parents about those PBs and nudging towards that more authoritative parent that tends to get those balances right.
On that, thank you, Professor Martin. Thank you for your time. Hopefully, our audience got some real nuggets of information and be more self-worth and be more motivated down the line.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure.